got it? Okay. I hope you don't mind if I give this presentation unmasked. I swear I'm clean. I've had 3 shots and I get tested weekly because I've got a 93-year-old lady who lives in my house named Mom. Anybody uncomfortable? Okay. Good. And I wouldn't want to kill Oren either. So, yeah, well, I always appreciate an opportunity to come back to Durham. I was here from 1989 to 1995. Do they still give PhDs in geology here, or do they have some other name like what, Earth and Ocean? My PhD is a collector's item. The program for the study of developed shorelines, which I direct, was founded here at Duke University in the mid-1980s by the gentleman sitting in the front row right here, Dr. Orrin Pilkey, who was my major professor and graduate advisor when I was a student here at Duke. I also am a little bit disconcerted because I noticed another member of my graduate committee seems to be on the Zoom, Bill Schlesinger. Although his attendance is sort of apropos because the reason that the program for the study of developed shorelines moved from Duke to Western Carolina, we're technically the program for the study of developed shorelines is still a joint Duke University, Western Carolina University Center. And we still have Orrin here, and we have lots of MEM graduate students that come to us in the summer through the Stand Back Fellowship Program. There's still a lot of cooperation, but essentially what happened is that when my friend Orrin retired, my wife refused to leave the mountains of North Carolina to consider coming to Duke University to run the center. And we were very fortunate at the time that the Duke and the UNC system were trying to find ways to collaborate on the marine sciences. And so we had this crazy idea of initiating this joint venture between Western Carolina University. Anybody ever been to Western Carolina University? Did you know that there's a Western Carolina? It's a beautiful place. We had this crazy idea, well, maybe we could create this joint venture. And well, long story short, that's sort of what happened. And Bill Schlesinger was dean of the Nicholas School at the time, signed off on the agreement with my provost. And so for the last 15 years now, the bulk of the activities of the program are happening in the mountains of North Carolina, which if you study sea level rise and storms is a pretty safe space to operate in. People always wonder why you would have a coastal program in the mountains. And I have a lot of smart ass answers to that question, but it is fairly practical, especially if you're sort of a global program. Really, all I need to be able to do is get to an airport. But honestly, when there's a big storm that's threatening the East Coast or the state, UNCW and ECU, they shut down and have to leave, and we keep operating. So that's one of the benefits. What I'd like to do today is just sort of have a conversation with you about the primary thing that we think a lot about, and that's coastal management, coastal adaptation, coastal resilience, call it whatever you want to, and how I think as a nation, we're really failing miserably at wisely dealing with these growingly important issues. And I'm going to introduce my complaints to you by giving you sort of a tour of the coast, starting in Louisiana. So just to be clear, even though the title of my presentation said that we're not doing anything right, it's not entirely correct. I just wanted to be a little bit hyperbolic, just to be interesting. So while I'm primarily going to assert today that I think we really are failing in a big picture way, at resilience and adaptation, that doesn't mean that everything we're doing is bad, okay? So don't get angry at me if you've been involved in a good adaptation project. My argument is going to be that the big picture is problematic. And well, let's start in Louisiana. And this is what really got me thinking about things. I've been working on the ground in coastal adaptation for more than 20 years now. At the program for the study of developed shorelines, we get our hands dirty, right? We help people comment on NEPA documents, EISs and EAs. We just finished creating new flood maps for Horry County, South Carolina, that are better than the FEMA flood maps because the FEMA flood maps were bad. The new ones, the ones they haven't even approved yet. We do vulnerability assessments for communities. We did a full municipal vulnerability assessment for every building in Duck, North Carolina. We have received several $1 million over the last 5 years to develop the protocol for assessing and scoring the vulnerability of every asset and every coastal park in the United States of America. And now we are deploying that protocol and literally putting a vulnerability score on every asset in every coastal park in the country. From the Statue of Liberty to an outhouse in the Everglades to totem poles in Sitka, Alaska. We are scoring the vulnerability of those assets. The whole point of it all is to help them make good adaptation decisions. It's about adaptation at the end of the day, spending your money wisely. That's the kind of level that we work at, trying to bring science to good decision making. So I'm really accustomed to being in rooms and talking a lot about adaptation with people of all political stripes and never talking about mitigation. If you don't understand the difference, mitigation is trying to stop climate change, basically. Adaptation is trying to get out of the way or find a way to deal with it. Folks who tend to lean politically conservative typically do not like to talk a lot about mitigation. These days, almost everybody is pretty comfortable talking about adaptation. So for a couple of decades, I felt really good in my little world doing adaptation. And then Hurricane Ida hit Louisiana. A year after Hurricane Laura and Delta decimated the western part of Louisiana around Lake Charles. And Louisiana is a state that has spent about $26 billion over the last 10 years doing coastal restoration and resilience projects. They've built 60 miles of barrier island, 60 miles of barrier island. They're going to spend about $25, $30 billion more over the next 10 years, a variety of different funding sources. And they've even, I would argue, they've done it the right way. They've evaluated projects from a very scientific perspective. They've looked at racial justice. They have acknowledged that some of the map is going to have to change. It's been an open process by and large in Louisiana. They've sort of done it the way you would sort of want people to do it. So they built 60 miles of these. I guess you can call it a barrier island. It's an engineered barrier island. A little bit of, this is a little bit of pipe left out there still. This is what it looked like after Hurricane Ida. I did a flight right after Hurricane Ida. So most of those barrier islands that were really tested by the storm, Ida didn't even notice they were there. There are giant gaps between these barrier islands, by the way. So I'm really not quite sure exactly what they hope to do other than protect places like this. This is Port Fourchon, which is out the end of the Delta. This is where almost all of our country's Gulf of Mexico deep water oil rigs are serviced from this place. Port Fourchon is pretty important to Louisiana and to the country. This is post-Ida. So you can see that this was an entirely restored barrier island before the storm. And you can see that it was pretty well run over during Ida. Oh, this is Grand Isle, Louisiana. mostly camps, as they call them in Louisiana, and second homes, but pretty modest scale. This area had been protected pre-storm by coastal restoration, but also there's a, hard to see, but there's a giant geotextile tube that's in here, a giant geotube that was completely submerged and broke in several places during the storm. That wasn't what really bothered me as much as my trip from New Orleans south through the Delta into little fishing communities, places like Jean Lafitte. And this is what it all looked like after $26 billion of expenditures, doing more coastal restoration than anybody else in the country has done, calling it resilience, telling people that this is both environmental restoration, but the real goal here is storm protection for the people of Louisiana to keep communities whole. When I do this post-storm reconnaissance, I like to just get out of my car and walk around and talk to people. And you'd be amazed at how many people are ready to talk to you after they've suffered through something like this. And again, so this is most of what was damaged. New Orleans didn't have a lot of damage other than they went without power for 2 weeks. But these are all modest middle-class homes. These folks here are all shrimpers. They lost their homes and their boats in Ida. Most of these people, believe it or not, don't have flood insurance. They don't have flood insurance because a lot of them have been living in the same homes for generations. The mortgage is paid off. Nobody's making them have flood insurance. If you've got a mortgage on your house, the bank wants you to have flood insurance if you're in a flood zone. You don't have a mortgage on your home, it's an old family home, nobody cares whether you have flood insurance or not. Your skin in the game. And so a lot of folks don't. So, you know, these people lost, they lost a lot. And what was really impressive to me about Ida, which it was not the biggest hurricane that we've seen on the U.S. East Coast. It took tens of square miles of wetland, lifted it up, and threw it into the homes in the Barataria Basin. It was like a combination of like a big Mississippi River flood with velocity and a hurricane. I'd never seen anything quite like it. This is a survey image from a company whose job it is to track the electricity grid and infrastructure in Louisiana. So this is the photo above is about 8 months before Ida. And the photo below is 2 days after. All of that, this is largely floating wetland, floating marsh, all of that gone overnight. And it all landed on the roads and the homes of the people south of New Orleans. Of course, what the media got excited about was that the levees held around New Orleans. Probably what a lot of you might have gotten if you were watching the story of Ida, was that the levees held. The levees did not hold during Katrina. They weren't really tested in the same way and in the same places during Ida, but apart from the $26 billion that was spent on coastal restoration, we spent another $12 billion or so reinforcing the levees, the pumps, and everything around New Orleans, and they did in fact hold. But I was so disturbed by the fact that here I am standing in this place that might be the role model for how we could develop a national plan for building resilience, because the Louisiana approach, I believe, had been pretty good. Good scientific vetting of projects, open discussion. And yet, here we go, and so much of the parishes south of New Orleans were just devastated. Most of the regular folks. And they still hadn't finished or hardly even started cleaning up the mess from the year before from all the parishes that are west of New Orleans along the coast. I mean, I was in Lake Charles this spring, and I've never seen so many windows missing still. If you fly over it, it's all blue from FEMA tarps still on all the roofs. In a place where we are spending so much money on resilience. And at the same time, I'm thinking about this. The new infrastructure bill is coming through Congress. And that infrastructure bill has a lot of money in it for resilience. So many people on my LinkedIn feed are excited that finally this infrastructure bill is recognizing that we need to put funding in there for climate change adaptation and resilience. And I'm standing there in southern Louisiana, and I'm thinking, would it matter? And to what degree would it matter? And the people that I talked to with these heartbreaking stories, who believed they were going to be protected, who believe that all of this spending and all of this planning is going to keep their culture alive, it's going to keep their communities whole, it's going to keep them in their place, in this unique culture that is Southern Louisiana. Of course, by the way, let me just say, every coast has its own unique culture. I know people in Louisiana like to talk about how wonderfully unique it is, and that's why we should be saving it. There's some truth to that, but every coast has a wonderful, unique culture. How do we save it all? Like when the place we've been focusing. Granted, Louisiana has some unique challenges. Highest rate of sea level rise in the country. It's flat. There are unique challenges in Louisiana, but still. And I was standing and I felt like our conversation about resilience and adaptation was really disconnected from people on the ground in places that we're making promises to. We need to reconnect that somehow. Okay, so let's go to Charleston. This is the Charleston Peninsula. 4 out of the last 5 years, the city of Charleston has been voted the most popular and wonderful tourist destination in the world. You know that? The world. Charleston. Yep. It's a cool city. Great food. Most of that is filled salt marsh because they filled it 200 years ago. And the Corps of Engineers is helping Charleston figure out what to do to protect the Charleston Peninsula. This is the proposal. The yellow part there is a seawall designed to withstand up to a Category 3 hurricane. The storm of record here is Hurricane Hugo. This would not protect from Hurricane Hugo. That would be too expensive. Category 3 storm. There's some pumps, there's a few other things in there. What you might notice is that the wall stops like here and here. And these orange blobs up here, those are sort of working class African-American communities. They're just outside the seawall. I'll try and explain why, although it's hard. Charleston is having a raging debate right now about this proposal from the Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps spent $3 million designing this wall. The city of Charleston has to decide this month whether they're on board or not. The project's going to cost about $1.2 billion. The city has to come up with about $300 million, which is a lot for them. This is the Rosemont community of Charleston right here. This is a community that is really culturally rich, entirely African-American and outside the wall. One of the things that we worry about, why is that community outside the wall? because the Army Corps of Engineers is required to do a benefit cost analysis for their project. The cost of the project has to be offset by benefits that at least equal the cost. The benefit cost ratio has to be 1 at least. Poor people, protecting poor people does not give you a lot of benefits in dollars in the way that we do cost analysis. That cost analysis, by the way, is used in every single storm damage reduction project that the Corps of Engineers does across the United States. It is a major moral failing of our society in the way we approach resilience and adaptation. Charleston, by the way, has other problems beyond just the fact that a hurricane might come in. They have some of the worst nuisance flooding in the country. Last year, we're talking about 30+ days, and streets were flooded just because it was high tide, spring tide. They've got inadequate stormwater handling that they're trying to fix, but they haven't completely fixed it yet. And they have a lot of rain bomb flooding that they haven't dealt with. So you get this major project that the Army Corps of Engineers comes in that's going to solve one problem, storm surge, when our coastal communities have so many other problems. It makes it really tricky to decide how to go about this. The seawall is not necessarily going to stop this, which is what keeps people from getting to work 30 days out of the year now. Sometimes you can't get to the hospitals because the medical district in Charleston, Medical University of South Carolina, is right on the water, and it is flooded during nuisance times. Very inconvenient. How do you decide? Well, typically what you have to do to decide is you have to rely on the Army Corps of Engineers economic analysis as to how a project is going to benefit your community. Let me try and give you some idea how an economic analysis goes in an environmental impact statement for the Corps of Engineers. This is everywhere. This is not just Charleston. Okay, but I'll use the Charleston example. Okay, so the first thing they have to do is create the hazard. So they generate a bunch of synthetic storms. They run those synthetic storms, in this case, into a model called ADCIRC, which is a pretty decent physics-based model that tries to approximate water flow and levels for a lot of different things. But in this case, for a storm event or a surge. So they take these synthetic storms and they run it through the model ADCIRC. ADCIRC produces water levels at the seawall or no seawall. On top of the water levels, they run a model called ST wave, which puts the waves on top of the storm surge. Follow me? Storms have high water levels and waves. By the way, the uncertainty in those model runs is not quantified. We know they're not exactly correct, but we don't know how not correct they are. Okay? Okay, so then we take the outputs from these model runs and we crank it into some economic modeling. First, we have to look at the sensitivity of the buildings that they're trying to get benefits from protecting. So they have to estimate building lot elevations. They have to estimate the height of the first finished floor of the building because that matters, whether the building is elevated or not. They don't have the time or the money to actually measure that, so they estimate it. The first finished floor elevations were done in like a Google drive-by kind of thing. Plus or minus 1.5 feet about is what they think the error might be from that. They actually quantified the error in that one, which is good. Then they have these building damage functions where they estimate the damage to particular types of building construction from the particular water level based on that estimated first floor elevation. Then they have to estimate property values over the next 50 years. 50 years for these places in Charleston, assuming, of course, that they're going to protect them all in a raging real estate market. Then they can calculate the damage averted from the project. And they report it like this. This is my favorite part. This is the benefit cost ratio. So in Charleston, 10.2. That's a great deal for federal taxpayers, isn't it? You get $10 back for every $1 you spend. So just think about it, where we started, right? Synthetic storms, modeling the water level, no uncertainty known or quantified. Waves on top, no uncertainty known or quantified. Economic analysis, estimates of building heights, building damage functions, all of that, error propagating through every step. And then they give us a benefit cost ratio that's got a decimal point. $10.2, right? You see any error bars on that? No. So if your benefit cost ratio turns out to be 10.2, I don't know, maybe you can swallow that. That sounds pretty good. The vast majority of beach nourishment projects, that I'm talking about in a second, have benefit cost ratios that come out like 1.02. If it was 0.99, you couldn't fund it. The error is unknown in this process. But every core project goes through this kind of cost analysis. It's really expensive. It was $3 million to do this. Before you start the project, $3 million. It is expensive, and I don't really see how it's helpful. And it's also damning to middle class and poor communities. They do it internally, the vast majority of the time. Yeah. This is a recent paper that basically also suggested that almost all the seawalls we're building are designed to protect from like a category 2 or 3 storm, just like a 100-year storm, simply because it would be astronomically expensive to try and build seawalls for all of our urban areas that would protect from a major storm, which is the one you're really, really worried about. So all of these hard structures that we're building, we're designing them for storms that are, in our current conception, are like a 100-year storm, a 1% chance of happening in any given year. Well, the next 50 years are probably going to be pretty different than the last 50 years. So what level of protection are you actually getting? And then here's the other problem with Charleston, which is a place I love very much, by the way. My wife's family goes back in Charleston for generations. My father-in-law, you can't even understand the guy, seriously. He's got such a strong Charleston accent. There aren't that many of them left anymore, but I mean, Mr. Carl, he's all Charleston. I love this place. This development right here, this is within the city of Charleston, even though it's on a place called James Island, just across the river. It's not even 2 years old. So you've got this place that's asking federal taxpayers for $600+ million of federal funds to build a seawall to protect the Charleston Peninsula, while they are still building directly in the floodplain in developments all around this, one of the fastest area growing counties in the US. And they fill and build, which is really a problem, because if you put your house on that, that means the water's still got to go somewhere, so it goes to your neighbors. There's so many problems to address. And we look at it in such a simplistic way. The Army Corps of Engineers is the primary agency responsible for coastal resilience in the United States of America. They get the vast majority of public funding, tens of billions of dollars. And this is the approach that they use. Cost analysis. The Army Corps asserts that they can only reduce damage from storm surge. They're not allowed to help the city fix all of those other infrastructure problems. The locality has to do that. So if you're the city of Charleston, you're sitting there trying to decide, what do I do? I'd really love to have that $600 million from the feds. But then again, we have all of these other problems as well. Where do you start? If, as a locality, you have to come up with $300 million to match the federal government. Well, of course, you could start by not putting stuff in harm's way anymore, but that's too hard. You look just up the coast from Charleston, and you see here's the Grand Strand of South Carolina, Myrtle Beach, North Myrtle Beach, Horry County, South Carolina, where the Army Corps of Engineers has been protecting that section of the coast for almost 50 years now. You get a great benefit cost ratio out of giant buildings like that. And after Hurricane Florence, the Corps was right out there after the storm, planning to put sand back in front of the Grand Strand. They're pretty good at that. This is a beach nourishment project being pumped up. This is not very far from Myrtle Beach. This is the rest of Horry County, South Carolina. Hit very hard by Matthew and Florence. No protection plan for these communities. They wouldn't meet the cost analysis. So instead, money comes to them through places like Housing and Urban Development and other federal agencies, where they recommend not protection to protect the value of their properties, but instead they recommend buyouts. The resort communities, we protect property value in place, get in from there, and largely we recommend buyouts. The Sockasty, this is a very middle class, largely white community, a lot of retirees. Bucksport, this is an African-American community in Horry County. In this case, they're both in the same boat, basically. They are in the same economic ship because there's no money to be spent to protect these places because their property values are not high enough. It would be tough anyway, honestly, but there's really not even an attempt. And you have to imagine what these people think when they look out at the Grand Strand, where we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars pumping sand in front of hotels and investment homes. There's a wonderful woman named A.R. Siders who has a bunch of different collaborators. She's at the University of Delaware now. She was a Harvard postdoc for a while. And Siders has built this national database of buyouts, which is really interesting. So the most interesting part about this national database of buyouts is that almost none of them have happened on the oceanfront. In fact, almost none of them have happened on the Barrier Islands at all. Where did they happen? Inland. People living in their primary residences of modest means. Now, that's not necessarily all bad, because in some cases, those people needed to go someplace safer. But it tells you something about what our priorities are and how the system is working right now, about what resilience means for one group of people compared to resilience for another group of people. Let's visit New Jersey on our tour. That's Mantoloking, New Jersey, following Hurricane Sandy. This was sort of the poster child of what Sandy did right after the storm. Ripped the island in half, just devastated the homes that were in the area. Obviously, with this level of damage and obvious vulnerability of this barrier island, those assets. Obviously, we abandoned that barrier island and it's now a park. Yeah, no, that's not what we did. It's pretty much all been rebuilt now, largely with federal funds. In fact, looking at how we've spent money post-Sandy, $60 billion was allocated by Congress to go to post-Sandy disaster aid. The Corps of Engineers got over $5 billion just to reduce future storm damage potential. Well, the primary adaptation action that has been taken, was taken post-Sandy, even on the oceanfront communities, was to elevate homes. Because really the only incentive we have to these communities is the Federal Emergency Management Agency's flood insurance program, and you get credit if you elevate your house. So there were a lot of homes that were elevated, not just in the working class communities in New Jersey and New York after Sandy, but also out on the barrier islands. Okay, so that's a pretty good thing. Yeah, we were pretty much elevating everything, right? Look at those happy people. They raised their house. It's not a bad thing to do. We even considered raising the downtown of the ironically named Highlands, New Jersey. I don't know, we've got a Highlands, North Carolina, and it's at 3,500 feet. Highlands, New Jersey, like 35. I know there's Highlands. That's not as good a story. It's still a storm vulnerable community. Are you from New Jersey? Well, then this is where your beaches come from. The problem with just elevating properties on a moving shoreline, on the ocean front, on a barrier island, even on the bay side, if you just elevate stuff, well, somebody's still got to hold the shoreline in place or they'll go to sea, right? Well, this is what we do. So after we use federal funds to help people elevate their homes, then we use federal funds to pump the beach back up in front of them. At the Program for the Study of Developed Shorelines, we've been doing this really strange thing since the mid-1980s, which is tracking every beach nourishment project in the country. It was this gentleman's idea right here, and we still do it now. Probably in the, I don't know, late 1980s, that didn't seem like a very sensible thing to do, but at the moment, it's probably one of the most valuable things that we have been doing through time. Because now everybody wants a beach. You can see the dots on the map. Those are beach nourishment projects. What you may notice from this is that the endangered species at the coast is not like a turtle or a piping plover. The endangered species is an unengineered beach. We are building a nation of beaches, all the way from Saco, Maine to Padre Island, Texas. The amount of sand that we're moving is extraordinary. So the red blots here, this is a heat map of beach nourishment projects. The red areas are where it's happening the most. New Jersey and Florida are definitely leading the parade. There's hardly a natural grain of sand left on the beaches in New Jersey, just a few places. The cost, as you might imagine, if everybody wants a beach, the cost is going up astronomically. Yet, in every one of these coastal communities, the Corps of Engineers right now is developing 50-year project formulations for new beach nourishment projects. 50 years. They're going to communities and they are promising that they will be putting sand on their beaches for 50 years. Sea levels rising, some places are running out of sand. It's impossible to estimate the cost when you see graphs like that of what's for even 20 years from now. If you just zero in on New Jersey, personal, New Jersey. This is just an example to give you a perspective on how much sand we're moving on the coast nationally. So let's look at the volume of sediment on the coast of New Jersey that we are moving. Okay, the typical sediment flux, when I was back as a little geology student, calculating sediment budgets for individual areas of the coast was an important thing that we did. How much sand is moving around? How much sand goes onto the beach, off the beach, into the inlet? How much is moving along shore? How much comes offshore? That's a sediment budget, right? We're trying to track where the sand's going. Okay, so typical longshore transport rates in New Jersey, which New Jersey has got pretty high longshore transport rates compared to many places in the country because there's a lot of wave energy and nor'easters. So sand moves a lot. So 130,000 to 200,000 cubic yards a year. So typically the rate at which the sand is moving along the beach in New Jersey. Well, in 2016 alone, we added 16 million cubic yards of sand to the New Jersey coast, coming from offshore a few miles, pumped onto the beaches. You average that over the entire length of New Jersey, that's about 135,000 yards per mile flux of sand onto the beaches that we put there. This is the Anthropocene, right? We are becoming the primary flux of sediment in the sediment budget. It's staggering to think about that. But the other question is, how long can you do that? 50 years? No. Sorry. It's just not enough sand. And there won't be enough money. If we really have 3 feet of sea level rise and we're struggling to protect Miami, Savannah, Charleston, Jacksonville, Boston, Manhattan, there's not going to be federal money for these projects. Folks are finally really starting to notice the scale of the sand that we're moving. Scott Armstrong and Eli Lazarus did a really interesting analysis of the United States Geological Survey's shoreline change work on the east coast of the US and realized that the erosion rates that are published for the East Coast by the USGS are way off because it's all being overshadowed by the level of beach nourishment that we do. We reset the shoreline position, and that's never been taken into account in these erosion rates that the USGS publishes that a lot of agencies use to guide things like setbacks from the coast and stuff. Beach nourishment is giving us a false sense of security on the coast. You want to see what we're doing? The Southern Governors Association asked us to give them some perspective for how much beach nourishment we're doing. So we just looked at the Southeast. So just the amount of sand that we've moved over the last 20 years, just in the southeastern US, you could build one beach that would be about 1 meter thick, 2,000 kilometers long, and 150 meters wide. That's how much sand we're moving. Just in this is just the southeast. I could talk about this part for a long time, but I won't in the interest of time. I will just say it's not environmentally benign. There is some evidence that it's reasonably good for turtles. After a year or so, turtles will be out there and they'll nest, and that's fine. It's not good for everybody else. There are environmental impacts. Beach nourishment kills all the infaunal organisms when the project's placed. There are impacts from the borrow area. A lot of times it looks like this, even though your beach might have been fine sand beforehand. This is a project in South Carolina. We have no idea what we're doing to the coast with beach nourishment. No idea. We have no idea what the cumulative impacts of our beach nourishment coastal protection program are. We take all this sand from borrow areas offshore, massive amounts of sand moved. All those organisms, benthic organisms, are killed. That cascades up into fisheries offshore. We dump it in the intertidal zone and kill everything that's there. That impacts foraging shorebirds, other charismatic fauna. If we only did it once, these are dynamic systems, they'd probably recover. They would recover. You just did it once and never did it again. But if you do it every 2, 3, 4 years, which is what we do, and if you do it everywhere, that's a classic example of cumulative impacts that the National Environmental Policy Act requires be assessed when you're doing an environmental impact assessment or an environmental impact statement for a project. But guess what? We really don't assess it. But we need to. Because all of these other things, they have economic value too. Fisheries, even shorebirds. Ask Audubon. They'll give you some good numbers. Currently, we're still spending Sandy money to build a beach from Fire Island to Montauk on Long Island, called the Fire Island Montauk Project, the FIMP. This is from an article that Bloomberg just released last week. Really nice article that you should check out with great graphics. I have to turn around to read it. But here's, again, it's typical, the same old story for our approach to coastal resilience. Bolstering communities, including Montauk, Southampton, and Fire Island, where the average home values are $1.7 to $2.8 million. And in Mastic, a seaside area between Fire Island and Southampton, where the prices average $3,100, federal funds will be used to acquire and destroy homes. This is my, the Corps says, in managing the immense flow of federal funds into the region, the Corps says it's acting to forestall the most economic damage. We are spending the money where we get the biggest bang for our buck. It may sound hard-hearted, but to be fiscally responsible and to be stewards of taxpayer money, we have to abide by the greater benefit of the public good. Obviously, the greater benefit of the public good is the preservation of property value, wealth. Is that it? Is that what we're all about? I don't know. That seems sort of subjective to me. We're moving so much. This is the Netherlands, coast of the Netherlands, right? These are the coastal engineers of the world now, the Dutch. Very nice people, very tall, which is their primary adaptation to sea level rise, I think, and flooding. Good idea. All of that is fake, by the way. It's big, beautiful. Oh my gosh, they spend so much money moving sand too. They build things that you like. This, see this dune? That's it. They call it a dune. Look, you can park under it. That's how big it is. We can't be this. We can't be the Netherlands. The Netherlands dominate our discussions of coastal resilience. Often in a good way, but they're different than we are. They're a small country. They're also all at sea level for the most part. We're not. We're a big country. We got other places to go. We can't be this. But it seems like that's what we're trying to be. And the projects just keep coming. Keep an eye on this one. $29 billion in Texas to build the Ike dike. This is the dike that would have theoretically protected Texas from Hurricane Ike. Of course, the most damaging storm in Texas history was Hurricane Harvey, and the flooding and the damage was almost entirely precipitation driven, and the $29 billion proposal would not have helped that at all. But it's moving forward rapidly. Yep. Yeah, so okay, here's my last little thing. Lots of people think that the solution to all of this is green infrastructure. Marshes, dunes, whatever. Coastal wetlands. You see lots of academic papers. I don't know, there's been like 300 of them in Nature Geoscience and Nature Climate Change trying to quantify the value of marshes to storm reduction. Give me a break. In the state of North Carolina, we're building living shorelines like crazy. At least part of that's living. It is fantasy to believe we can build enough marsh to provide significant infrastructure protection. I'm sorry. I mean, marshes can be used to stabilize an eroding shoreline degree, but they're not storm protection. Green infrastructure as a solution to all of these problems is an environmental fantasy. I wish it were true. My dissertation was marshes. I love them. Spent 6 years walking in them in Eastern North Carolina. You would have to build kilometers of marshes to have any measurable benefit to something like that. It's a fool's errand, in my opinion. And the other thing I don't like about it is that it takes away from the only way we really can save these wetlands. And that's to get out of the way and let them move. We're spending billions trying to push marshes back out into the bays. But every one of those living shorelines and new marshes comes with an expiration date. If we get a meter of sea level rise, those things can't maintain themselves where they are. We're pushing them out of equilibrium. They want to be moving back. So remember, I said that I was going to generalize. That doesn't mean all of these projects are worthless. Trust me. Some of them are good. But what I am afraid of is that we're taking our eye off the ball. We're not doing the thing that would actually save the marshes. We're doing the thing that's going to save the roads and the houses. Okay, let me jump to. This is where I was going to make fun of Scape, but I can do that in another way. Okay, so here's the real problem. It's us. One, we're still putting lots of stuff in the way. So after all of that pessimism, what do I suggest we do? Well, I think it's reasonably straightforward to talk about. It's just almost impossible to implement. I mean, we have to stop building in the floodplain, and we have to stop building on the ocean front, period. And I don't know how you enforce something like that, but it sure seems to me that if you are continuing to rapidly develop your floodplain, your oceanfront and low-lying areas, at the same time you're asking for federal money to protect other infrastructure in your community, that we should just flip the bird at you. You got to give us something back, right? You want money to protect stuff, then stop making more stuff that needs to be protected. Something like that, at least. I don't know how you make it happen. Honestly, I think it's time to pull federal investment from coastal resort communities in general, period. After Sandy, Chris Christie said, you can't walk away from the Jersey Shore. It generates $32 billion a year in income. I'm like, okay, where'd all that money go? If it's generating $32 billion a year in income, then maybe you should take some percent of it every year and pay for your own vulnerability. I mean, we hear this argument all the time. The coastal zone is too economically important to not put federal money in there. And I think, okay, if it's that economically important, then the solution is easy. Tax yourselves. At a room charge. I don't know. Carteret County, North Carolina is doing it gangbusters right now. They have millions in the bank from lodging taxes that they are keeping. And they have kicked the Corps out of doing their beach nourishment projects. Everybody could do that. The Corps has to fix or abandon their cost analysis, and they have to stop promising 50-year formulation. It's literally insane to think that you can go to any community in the United States of America and tell them what's going to happen 50 years from now with their beach. It's also maladaptive to give people hope that their oceanfront is going to look exactly the same 50 years from now. Protecting infrastructure with nature-based solutions is not great for those nature-based solutions. I don't think we should stop doing it everywhere. I think there are good projects and meaningful projects, and it can slow the tide, and it can add ecosystem values in this place and that place. But nobody's talking about the other part, which is if we want those marshes around 50 years from now, living shorelines are not going to save them. Only moving marshes will save them. Just the truth. And then we need some sort of a national plan or vision. We spend tens of billions of dollars a year on resilience at the coast. We've got no plan. It's reactive, not proactive. I mean, Congress doesn't function anymore. So they give the Corps money and they say, come tell us what you did. We have no vision for where the federal interest really lies. We have no vision for economic or environmental justice in that spending. We have no scientific vision for where it makes the most sense to spend money. Does it really make sense to spend all that money in Louisiana when the rate of sea level rise is 10 millimeters a year? And then the last two, which is really the take-home message, if we're talking about keeping people safe, which is where we always seem to talk about, at least that's what politicians like to talk about, there's only two ways to keep people safe. Get them out of harm's way and mitigate climate change. The only way we have a chance of saving southern Louisiana is to stop climate change. And I've spent the last 20 years of my life trying not to say that in rooms full of politicians, because you get so much pushback and people don't want to talk about it. And I got to say it from now on. That's what I learned in Louisiana. That's our only hope. Let's hope that there's some good discussions going on in Scotland. I was listening to President Biden talk live while I was driving. We'll see. Thanks. So, first of all, I think that this is the kind of national conversation we need to be having that we don't have, right? These are intractable problems to a large degree. We may decide as a nation that trying to keep those kinds of communities in place as long as we can is within our national interest. If they're in their primary residence, and those tend to be more affordable homes to try and lift or something like that, right? I mean, we may decide that. Compared to out on the barrier islands, it's all investment property. You look at who owns the homes on the ocean front, and it's usually like LLCs and foundations and stuff. So I don't know that the response would be that we take all of those Bayside communities in New Jersey and New York and even in Eastern North Carolina and expect those people to relocate. It would be way easier and more affordable to elevate and protect those places than what we're doing out on the ocean front. And it all depends on how much sea level rise we have over the next few decades, honestly, as to what the fate of those places will be. But this is what we need to talk about, honestly and openly. And right now, we just spend a ton of money without discussing that kind of thing at all. I'm not an economist, and there certainly are a ton of academic papers and a lot in the news media these days about not just the insurance industry, but the reinsurance industry and the impact that they're going to have on coastal development. A lot of what I have read and seen says that insurance is about to become unaffordable for everybody at the coast. and that the reinsurance industry is about to walk away and stuff like that. And that's what I read. But then when I go to the coast, that's not what I see. What I see is a real estate boom that continues. Let's take a couple of communities I work in South Carolina, Fripp Island, which is a gated community, and most of Hilton Head. You know how many homes are on the market right now in those two places? Zero. Zero. You know why? They've all been purchased. And as soon as something goes on the market, it sells for cash. Yes, yeah, that's what's going on right now. So, I mean, I understand that you would think that at some point, private insurers are going to walk away from all of this mess. But there seems to be this gaping disconnect from what's going on right now in US real estate markets and development of the coast, and what all the experts think has to happen sometime soon. And maybe it's all going to crash. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to really understand how all of that works. But I will tell you that when there are major pressures on insurance prices, states typically step in and create public markets. That's what Florida did. Florida is the largest insurer of private property in the state of Florida now. That was after Hurricanes Andrew and then a really bad hurricane season in 2005, I think it was, like 3 storms, and several insurers pulled out and the state stepped in. In the state of North Carolina, we have wind pools for our 18 or so counties in Eastern North Carolina. Did you know this? If you're a property owner in North Carolina, and if a big storm breaks the bank of that wind pool, then they get to raise the insurance rates on everybody in the whole state. So the basic problem, I think, is that all of this coastal development is not really market-based. We're not seeing the market drive prices and incorporate the true vulnerability into any of the pricing of those homes, because the public sector is subsidizing all of the risk. So at the moment, there are way more incentives for people of means, especially, to stay where they are, to rebuild, to stay there. And then the people who are not of means, the programs to support and help them in any way are inadequate and take years to formulate. The community that I showed you from Sockasty, from Horry County, outside of Myrtle Beach, they've been waiting for promised buyouts for years since Hurricane Florence. So, I think the problem has several layers. One is that we still treat all of these systems unequally. We have poor implementation. It takes forever. The government moves so slow, especially for the people who need the help the most. I'm very supportive of organized, well-executed government programs that will help people who want to get out of harm's way get out of harm's way. But that's not where most of the money's going. And the people that we target to get them out of harm's way are usually not involved in the decision making, and they see their neighbors being offered protection. And that's a pretty hard sell, right? I mean, if I knew the answer to that question, Peter, I would run out the door, jump in my car, and drive directly to where I could do that. I'm not sure. I think, so the Army Corps of Engineers is supposed to be overseen and driven basically by legislation, by Congress, by Water Resource Development Act funding. And we have a completely dysfunctional legislature in the United States of America that even when it's controlled by when both houses are controlled by the same party, they still can't get things done. So any hope we have that Congress, who it's really should be their job to oversee this, to guide it, to manage it, to allocate the spending, to tell them how to do it, to have them, there's not terribly optimistic about that. You know, the only hope we might have is for local communities to demand more. And, you know, I think Miami-Dade that you mentioned is pushing back a little bit on the Corps' 3x3x3 formulation. And I think Charleston is going to reject the wall. You heard it here first. And maybe that'll change some things. I don't know. So of course, I have not examined every single core project, but I can tell you that in the formulations that I have looked at, and including the most recent Charleston valuation, the very first thing they say in the executive summary is that we're doing this for human safety and to save human lives and property. Then there's a gigantic analysis of property damage averted, and there's zero analysis of how it's going to help people or save human lives. Zero analysis. I can also tell you that in the Charleston Peninsula, the target of this particular project, there's been one human life lost to flooding since 1968. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that the future is going to be like the past, but it's somewhat disingenuous to say this is going to save a ton of lives. So I don't think so. But yeah, I mean, that EPA analogy is a decent one. Certainly the Corps should be thinking about things in similar terms. And I don't know how you push that in that direction.